Good afternoon and welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In today's discussion, I'm going to discuss about sociological theories of development and dependency. Now, before we start discussing what is development, how we understand development, let us try to understand what in general would development mean. And we know by and large when we hear this term development, it implies progress, it implies change, transformation. Now, this transformation or change is necessarily understood as being positive. So, as long as we go by this general understanding, there is no kind of critical need to understand it. But when we look into the political economy of the genesis of this term and try to understand the sociology of development, we realize that there is a lot of thinking about the way in which development has been linked to a certain kind of prejudice, a certain kind of the way in which it is considered as progress towards a certain kind of cultural, socio-economic setup. And that is, in the social sciences, we know that with the emergence of modernity, what was done was in terms of highlighting the economic system or the economy of the Western country as progressive, and those who were in the eastern side were considered to go by the model of development in the West. And that becomes necessarily to go deep into the understanding of development. And when we look into development, we will discuss that there are various theories of understanding development in relation to industrialization, modernization, and therefore there are basically two kinds of theory which we need to understand. One as development implying modernity, modernization as it was taking place in the Western country, which were regarded as undergoing the complete process of capitalism. And then there was second set of argument which says that those who were kind of categorized or labeled as developing or the third world were those which were dependent on the Western developed industrialized society. So this is kind of a framework within which we will make sense of the idea of development and dependency. So to begin with, when we look into the meaning of development, it can be understood in a wide range of terms, but if we were to kind of systemize it, we see that development refers to three different things. One is a process of change. Now, this process of change could be change in the economic setup. Say, for instance, it could be shift from subsistence economy as a process of production to a market-based economy. So, economy changes, the social relation changes, and so forth. The second way of understanding development is to consider it with reference to policy, or what are kind of considered as practice related to evaluative outcome. Now, when we bring in this understanding of evaluative, so we need to kind of have a model against which we would evaluate a country's progress or a region progress, whether the country or the region is moving towards the model or it is not. So the positive development from a policy framework where we have heard a lot of discourse on development discourses, sustainable development goals, industrialization, the whole idea of moving towards a neoliberal capitalist economy. These are evaluative framework within which we are going to understand development. And the third is to understand is that the dominant discourse. Now, when we talk about dominant discourse, it implies that there is a certain kind of a hierarchy. There is a certain kind of scaling which has been done by certain academia or certain kind of discourses coming from a particular regional area, and that becomes a kind of a hegemonic discourse whereby then there is a kind of negating the other kind of changes. So the economic development, the materialistic development in terms of more technology, more industries would be considered as progressive development. And if a society was giving more emphasis references to the non-materialistic aspect, to the social cultural aspect, then it was considered as underdeveloped, or it was considered as belonging to that dichotomy of the tradition and modernity. So there was a kind of ranking or scaling which we will also understand in the course of the lecture. Now when we look into this understanding of development, we see all the three, whether we look into as a change, as a kind of evaluative process, or as part of the dominant discourse, they are intertwined, but at the same level they can be segregated. Now this becomes very important why the discourse on development is contested. You cannot kind of have one particular way in which development can be understood. What is very important is in terms of understand the nitty-gritty of the development with specific focus on the socio-cultural political setup of the particular country or region. Now when we look into these three ways in which development is understood, we know that it kind of includes scales ranging from individual to community based. So we have, as student of sociology, read this quite often, that the Western society is moving towards individualism, whereas India is based on community. So if we were to kind of follow the model of the West, then it has to move from community to individual. Then we need to kind of understand the range or scaling at the regional level, where we kind of rank certain part of the country as underdeveloped, or as kind of what we would call as states which needs a lot of state support for economic and political growth, and also at the global level. So when we look into the three ways of understanding development, let us first try to understand development as change. Now this development as change could be taking place from within the society, or it could be as a result of interaction. Now when we talk about change from within, there is a possibility of an evolutionary process of change. So in the previous lecture, we discussed about the theories of change, and one of the theory was evolutionary, that society is changing from a simple society to a complex society, say from a home-based society, economic society, to a market-based society. So it's taking place within. Now this change within is not kind of exclusive. It also depends on the level of interaction between the other society. So the other kind of change could be development as interaction. Now when we look into interaction, it implies that two different socio-economic cultural setup or societies are interacting with each other, and when they interact, certain qualities are exchanged in terms of economic quality, social cultural quality, but it's always not two-way exchange of ideas or setup. What happens, one is kind of considered as more superior, as being more having a better setup, and therefore the other, which is kind of negated or on the margin, is kind of supposed to move towards the one which is labeled as more. And one of the example to understand development as interaction in our own context would be the process of westernization, which in sociology has been studied by a number of sociologists, mainly M.N. Srinivas. When we read westernization, we see that there was a kind of model of the Western culture in terms of religious practice, in terms of certain habits, behaviors, modes of culture, and therefore it was a process of or a development due to interaction. Now the second is to understand development as an evaluative outcome. Now when we look into it as an evaluative outcome, as I already said, here we would rank or scale the society on the basis of the level of development. Now I already stated this development would be in terms of how much of technology the society has increased, how much of industrialization has taken place, how much of the economy has developed. So one of the scale which is very relevant to understand development is the categorization of at the global level into the three world. We have all heard of this, the first world, the second world, and the third world. Now, the first world, just to revise the basic, means countries which have a complete transformation of the economy, and there is a kind of central capitalism or a capitalist model of development. Now, the second world would consist of those who are moving towards capitalist transformation, but it is still not complete, but yet they have achieved a great amount of economic development. For instance, Soviet Union and the East European group. And the third world, which we are all familiar, is the Asian country, Latin America, which would be to kind of consider as countries which are still undergoing the process of development. So it's also kind of referred as the developing society. And if we were to look into a kind of a more critical analysis, all the third world countries are countries which have had colonial rule. So basically, another way of making a distinction was to differentiate between the colonized and those who were the colonial rules and the colonized. So this was a kind of a certain mindset in which the scaling was done. Now, in order to understand development as a discourse or as a concept, it's very important to understand this emergence of the concept of third world. Now, this term was third world was first coined by French demographer Alfred Sauvy in 1952 at the height of the Cold War. Now, the Cold War between the Western capitalist and the Eastern socialist bloc. It was then used to apply to less developed countries that remained outside these two blocs, then respectively centered on the United States and Soviet Union. So the first sense of the phrase was the kind of coming in from the French Raya that was kind of considering it as the third force. So you have a first force, the second force, and the third force. Now the third force here in a political discourse would refer to the non-alignment rather than underdevelopment. So in its initial use of the term, the third world was basically a political use. It was to refer to certain countries which were not part of the first bloc and the second bloc. But the emergence was political, but over a period of time, the meaning of this term third world will take on an economic sense. And that is when we kind of look into the debates or the discourse through the 1960s through 1980s. So 1960s, a lot of countries became independent and the Cold War weakened. Now when the political rivalry or the political war was coming to an end, there was a kind of a contrast between different countries at the global level on their economic status. And therefore, this scaling of the developed and the developing was a new distinction that emerged between relatively rich country, capitalist country, and the poor nation. The formers were those who were kind of considered as developed, as I already said, were industrialized. They had undergone the process of industrialization and capitalism was in its full swing. Now, this also had a geographical distinction. So, one level is an economic distinction between the rich country and the poor country. The other level is a geographical distinction between the north and the south. Now, most of the third world countries fall into the southern hemisphere. So, we also in kind of understanding development, we need to understand the north-south dichotomy. Now, as stated in the beginning, the concept has undergone a lot of shift and change. And how do we understand the development? It's not kind of to be understood in a vacuum, but it needs to be understood with reference to the economic political changes taking around. And here it is at a global level. So the concept have kept changing and its meaning depends on the social change in the given society and also the period. So it's a temporal and spatial concept. So 1945 to 60, the concept developed with the process of transformation which was taking place in the West. And the process of development was interpreted according to the process of economic growth in Europe and other Western nations. But the same kind of economic social changes were not taking place in the non-European or non-Western society. However, it was kind of categorized as the perfect model of economic development, and therefore those who were not into the same framework were considered as lower in their economic development. 1970s to 1980, the understanding of the concept of development gave priority to participation of ordinary citizen. So it was now kind of shifting to the mass, to the larger population, and policies were framed, and therefore it kind of becomes a description of the policy framework, where most of the countries basically in the developing or the third world countries were framing policies, and these policies were generally framed by international institutions and world organizations, which were in order to ensure that these developing nations followed the path of development. So it was a democratic process of development. Why? Because it was kind of giving voice to the ordinary people. The ordinary people, the mass, were encouraged to participate actively in the process of formulating development policy. And most of the time, this whole idea of income disparity, regional disparity were identified, income gap were identified, and policies and programs were kind of handled to remove away this disparity and inequality in a strategy to move from underdeveloped to a developed nation. So 1980s we see that now, because so much of focus is on the democratic process of the population, the mass, moving towards social egalitarian relations, towards economic egalitarianism, the 80s becomes a significant period when it was kind of associated with social growth. Now, the social growth was not independent of economic growth. It was kind of argued that only when the economy of the country developed or the region developed would there be possibility of social growth. So, the idea was to improve the income level. The idea was to improve the overall production level in order to, and especially of the third world countries, that they need to increase their GDP, they had to increase the material base in order to have a social living standard. So 80s was also a period where there was a lot of economic crisis, famines, and it was kind of lot of international force comes into the picture in order to as relief, providing relief to the people or the victims of economic crisis. And the objective of these international institutions was to ensure the basic needs, and therefore the human development becomes very significant, and the basic human essential needs had to be given to the larger population in order to ensure that the nation progressed. So economic growth was just part of the equation of the whole concept of development in the 1980s. But if we look into the shift taking in place from the 40s to the 80s, we see that the discourse on development moves from, say, political discourse to social egalitarianism to ultimately to the idea of economic growth. And this was kind of drawing momentum from post-war decolonization, 1930 depression, and the emergence of superpower, which was kind of considered as a strategy of the colonial countries to kind of establish their hegemony over the underdeveloped or the countries where there was kind of economic crisis or disparity. So when we look into development as economic growth, it kind of comes into the idea of the number of theories which has been given by sociologists in terms of understanding the shift and changes, social change, economic change, and these theories are in terms of modernization theory, dependency theory, the theory of neoliberal economy, and therefore there's also kind of lot of understanding of tradition versus modernity versus the Western model of development, the Eastern model of development. So to understand the process or the concept of development, let us look at some of the approaches which has been used in order to understand the process. Now, when we look into approaches, we can understand development from two perspectives. One is to understand development from the top. That is, you have a bird eye view. This is an understanding of the process, how much of transformation is taking place, how much of progress is taking place. The evaluative basis is done by experts. They are the people who are in the policy makers, they are the people who are the leaders, and they kind of give us this idea whether the nation is developed or not. The idea is to actually focus on planning and execution of the development scheme by the central government or the apex body of administration, and here then the focus is more in terms of being a democratic process of development. The second approach is development from bottom or development from below. Now, when we try to understand development, we have to understand whether the programs, policy or social change has impacted the people and the larger population, or basically we need to understand how the process of the development has impacted the marginalized, those on the periphery, and therefore the approach to understand development from the bottom would focus on the community. So the local community becomes significant, and the development initiative are made in a manner to focus on the community development programs. So you have microfinance and several other programs which are targeted to the community, and there's a lot of kind of understanding of the community ownership, a commitment, accountability, and it is kind of seen as not something which is coming from the top, but an approach to development where there is a larger participation of the community itself. The other way of understanding development is also to understand the sectoral and area development. Now, the sectoral development, as we know, is a sector which would be kind of, if we kind of look into certain sectors of the economy in terms of the primary, secondary, tertiary, or we look into the agricultural sector and the industrial sector, the sectoral development is to focus on certain particular sector of the economy. For instance, if we were to kind of boost the agricultural development, then we need to kind of ensure the education of the farmers, then we need to ensure better agriculture technology, loans for the well-being of the farmer. So this is kind of focused to one particular sector. Now, area development would be to kind of identify area within a region or a country which would require more focus than compared to the other, and the command area development scheme for the development of irrigation resources is one example of this. Now, when we look into approaches, development cannot be understood without referring to Amartya Sen's capability approach. Now, what is capability approach? Now, capability approach focuses directly on the quality of life. Now, when we look into the capability approach, it becomes very significant because there is a lot of debates or critique of understanding development from an economic perspective in terms of only looking into the materialistic development, that if economy is better, the materialistic life improves, the improvement will take. Here the focus now shifts into the individual capability, whether they have the freedom, they have the choice to kind of select the way in which they would want the development to take place. So the quality of individual life and whether they are able to achieve it is analyzed in terms of the two concepts, functioning and capability. Now, functionings are state of beings and doing, such as being well nourished, having shelter. So, only when you have the functioning, you will be able to ensure that you are able to fulfill or fully utilize your capability. So, capability refers to the set of valuable functioning that a person has effective access to, and therefore person's capability reflects the effective freedom of an individual to choose between different functioning combination between different kinds of life. Now, capability approach became a basis for measurement of development by all these Human Development Index, which was developed by UNDP, and this became very significant in understanding the development in the 1990s. The other theory which is also significant is theory of world system, which is associated with Immanuel Wallerstein. He believed that the country's mode of incorporation into the capitalist world economy is the key feature in determining how economic development takes place in that nation. Immanuel Wallerstein believed in a single path of development. So according to his theory, capitalist world economy is a global system divided into hierarchy of three major types: the core, state, semi-peripheral area and peripheral area. The third theory, which is very important, is modernization theory. Now, as I've already said, modernization theory would differentiate between two kinds of society. One was the traditional society, the other was the modern society. Now, the traditional society would be those who would be based on, say, home subsistence economy, a certain kind of lack of, say, technology or organized means of production. And the modernization theory would say that in order for the society to develop or progress, you had to move towards technology, you had to move towards more complex division of labor, and that would kind of make the society more industrialized. So when we look into these approaches and the way in which development have been debated and discussed, we get a comprehensive understanding of development. With this, I come to an end of this lecture. Thank you.